Everybody's heard the legend of Nazi gold. But the actual story has nothing to do with buried treasure, and everything to do with a geopolitical suppression operation that stripped General George S. Patton of his authority and may have stripped him of his life. When Patton cracked open the financial backbone of the Third Reich, he wasn't looking at a war trophy. He was staring at a diplomatic catastrophe, one that led straight back to Swiss banking vaults and allied financial institutions. Patton pushed for full exposure. Washington demanded the opposite. What followed was a collision that erased billions from the record and ended with a death no honest investigator can explain cleanly. The whole thing began with pure chance. April 1945. Military police flagged a visibly anxious French woman near the Merca salt mine. She mentioned trucks, covered, moving at night. Hours later, Patton's soldiers were standing before a sealed steel door buried 300 feet beneath the earth. Behind it, something cold and metallic that no one could immediately name. They blasted the door open. What waited on the other side defied comprehension. 250 tons of gold bullion, every bar stamped with a Reich eagle, arranged in rows so meticulous, so deliberately ordered that this was clearly the product of years of systematic planning. Because it was. 8,000 paintings looted from museums and private homes across occupied Europe. Rembrandts, Rubens, works that had hung in the Louvre, in apartments in Warsaw, in family estates in Amsterdam, before the Nazis came and stripped everything bare. Hundreds of millions in foreign currency drawn from every nation Germany had swallowed. Diamonds, jewelry, entire collections of rare coins. And then, something that silenced every man in the room. Hundreds of small bags, neatly labeled, carefully sorted, filled with gold teeth and fillings ripped from the mouth of concentration camp prisoners. The complete financial reserve of the Third Reich, entombed underground while the country above it burned to ash. Guarded by two aging soldiers who dropped their weapons the instant they saw American uniforms. Not a single shot fired. Patton came down personally. He walked that mine for 2 hours straight. The officers beside him would later say they'd never witnessed anything like it. No bravado, no speeches. None of the deliberate theatrical fury that defined his reputation. Just a man moving slowly through corridors of stolen wealth, pausing before a canvas here, lifting a document there. Speaking almost nothing. When he finally surfaced, he issued 3 orders on the spot. Those 3 commands reveal exactly who Patton was when no cameras were rolling and no audience was watching. First, full armored perimeter around the mine. Nobody enters, nobody leaves without his direct personal clearance. Patton had served long enough to understand a basic truth about human nature. Put soldiers and treasure in the same space, and the outcome is always the same. Second, total inventory. Every painting catalogued, every gold bar recorded, every bag of dental fillings documented, not as a military formality, as criminal evidence. Evidence Patton was determined to preserve so that no future diplomat could quietly negotiate it away once the war ended and the deal-making began. Third, an urgent dispatch to Eisenhower's headquarters. Come immediately, see this with your own eyes, because this changes the entire calculation. Eisenhower arrived 2 days later alongside General Omar Bradley. The 3 generals descended together in a narrow mine elevator that Patton would later describe in his diary as genuinely terrifying. Consider what that admission means. A man who had absorbed gunfire and artillery and near death more than a dozen times across 4 years of combat. A man who had never once confessed to fear of anything called that elevator ride terrifying. They reached the bottom. They walked through the vault. They saw the gold, the paintings, the bags of teeth. Eisenhower said nothing for a long time. Then he stated plainly that the entire world needed to witness this, every piece of it, because he was already thinking ahead, to the people who would eventually stand up and claim none of it ever happened. He wanted that denial rendered impossible. Patton agreed without hesitation. And this is one of the only moments across the entire war where these two men stood on perfectly identical ground. Their relationship was fractured, combative, loaded with years of friction, but here, on this, there was zero distance between them. Expose everything, force the world to look, make denial a thing no honest person could attempt. Patton had journalists and photographers brought to that mine within days. He personally arranged for sitting members of the United States Congress to fly in, walk through the vault, see the gold, the paintings, the bags of teeth, all of it, with their own eyes. Because Patton grasped something most generals never did. Wars aren't only decided on the field. They're decided by the narratives that survive afterward. And he was going to make sure this narrative got told, loudly, completely, by as many witnesses as possible, before anyone could find a way to muffle it. Newsreel crews filmed the bullion. Photos ran in papers across America. For roughly 2 weeks in April 1945, the Merkers mine was the most famous location on Earth. Patton was the man who'd cracked it open. Everything appeared clean and simple. Then Washington told him to pump the brakes. Because here's the chapter of this story that almost no one ever hears. The chapter that explains how a discovery this monumental, this cinematic, this historically explosive somehow vanished from public memory, quickly and almost totally. That gold did not simply belong to Germany. A staggering portion had been looted from Poland, from Czechoslovakia, from Hungary, from Yugoslavia. Nations that were, at that precise moment, sliding under Soviet dominion as the Red Army advanced west. The question of who gets the gold could not be separated from the question of who controls the countries it was taken from. And that was a conversation no one in Washington or London wanted aired publicly in April 1945. The alliance with Stalin was still officially holding. The Pacific War still raged. American strategists were calculating they might need Soviet cooperation to invade Japan. Handing gold back to Poland meant recognizing the Polish government in exile in London, a direct collision with Stalin, who had his own hand-picked Polish government ready to install in Warsaw the instant the war concluded. Nobody in Washington wanted that confrontation over bullion, not with larger confrontations still ahead. But that was only half the problem. Some of that gold hadn't traveled directly from European vaults into the Merkers mine. Some had passed through Switzerland first. The Swiss National Bank had accepted Nazi gold throughout the war, no questions asked. And portions of that gold had subsequently flowed into accounts tied to American and British financial institutions. Institutions that had maintained business relationships with Germany before the war, and in certain cases, quietly during it. A thorough public audit of every bar in that mine, each one traced to its original owner, would have tugged on threads leading to places that extremely powerful, extremely respectable figures on both sides of the Atlantic had overwhelming reasons to keep buried. This was not a conspiracy in any dramatic sense. It was something far more ordinary, and in certain respects, far more unsettling. The people making decisions about the Merkers gold had personal and institutional stakes in ensuring specific questions were never raised too loudly or resolved too completely. Patton had zero interest in any of it. He genuinely, thoroughly, almost combatively refused to care about diplomatic sensitivities or political entanglements or the financial exposure of powerful men who'd made uncomfortable choices before the war. He cared about the soldiers who had bled to take Germany. He cared about the people the Nazis had murdered. He cared about ensuring that what had been stolen found its way back to the people it was stolen from. And he said so, loudly, repeatedly, with a kind of raw bluntness that made him devastating on a battlefield, and nearly impossible to handle anywhere else. He demanded faster restitution. He demanded greater transparency. He demanded a complete public record of every item in that mine and every decision made about it afterward. He made enemies in Washington. He made enemies at the State Department. He made enemies among Allied administrators tasked with managing post-war Germany. Officials who found Patton's insistence on doing the right thing, publicly and loudly, to be, as one internal memo phrased it, operationally inconvenient. In September 1945, 5 months after cracking open the Merkers vault, Patton was stripped of command of the Third Army. The official justification was a press conference where he drew a comparison between Nazi party members and American political parties, Republicans and Democrats, arguing that former Nazis ought to be permitted to help run post-war Germany because they were the only ones who knew how. It was a reckless thing to say. Patton understood that the instant the words left his mouth. But the people who wanted him gone had been hunting for an excuse for months. He handed them one on a silver plate. They reassigned him to a hollow administrative role. No troops, no authority. His new job was writing a history of the war that nobody commissioned and nobody would read. He was 59 years old, the most effective battlefield commander America had ever produced. And they had quietly placed him on a shelf. 3 months later, December 9, 1945, Patton sat in a staff car on a road outside Mannheim. A U.S. Army truck driven by a man named Robert Thompson made an abrupt left turn and struck his vehicle. The impact was low speed. No one else in either vehicle suffered serious injury. But Patton's neck snapped. 12 days later he was dead, the sole fatality of a collision that, by every measurable standard, should not have killed anyone. The details of that crash have drawn suspicion ever since. Robert Thompson gave contradictory accounts of what happened and why he turned when he did. A key witness named Frank Kupiaki later insisted the accident scene had been tampered with before investigators arrived. In 2008, a former OSS officer named Douglas Bazata claimed publicly that he had been contracted to assassinate Patton and that the car wreck had been staged. His account has never been fully corroborated, and historians remain split on its credibility. What no one disputes is this. Patton had been accumulating powerful enemies for months. He had been loud about his plans to return to America and enter politics. He had been openly hostile toward the post-war settlement being constructed around him. And his death arrived at precisely the moment when the people who found him dangerous had every reason to want him silent. Of the 250 tons of gold recovered at Merkers, a substantial portion was eventually returned to the nations it had been looted from, through a process that dragged on for decades and was never fully completed. Most of the artwork was recovered and repatriated, though certain pieces remain missing to this day, surfacing occasionally at auction houses under circumstances that provoke deeply uncomfortable questions. But the gold itself, the bars, the coins, the dental fillings, was never fully accounted for. Researchers working from declassified documents released in the 1990s estimated that somewhere between 10 and 20% of the total value from Merkers simply vanished in the months following the war's end. Some was pocketed by individual soldiers amid the chaos of the final weeks of combat. Some was seized by former Nazi officials who used it to bankroll their escapes to Argentina, Brazil, and Spain, funneled through red lines organized with help from the Vatican and certain American intelligence officers. And some of it, according to those same declassified files, was quietly folded into post-war reconstruction accounts and intelligence budgets controlled by people who had powerful incentives to make sure nobody ever looked too closely at where the money originated. Patton found that gold. He fought to make the world aware of it. He demanded transparency and accountability at exactly the moment when the people running things wanted neither. He was stripped of command, sidelined, then killed in an accident that has never been satisfactorily explained, in a country he had helped liberate 3 months before he planned to go home. The gold he uncovered remains unaccounted for 80 years later, and the full story of what happened to it and to him has still never been told.